The summer I turned 17, I watched my best friend disappear into thin air, and for 34 years, everyone believed I was the one who killed her. My name is Rebecca Shaw, and this is the story of Krista Martin, the girl who vanished from Hollow Creek, Wisconsin, on August 14, 1989, the night that would define my entire existence, destroy my reputation, and haunt every single moment of my waking life until the truth finally clawed its way out of the darkness. Before you scroll away, I need you to understand something. This isn't just another missing person story. This is about what happens when an entire town decides you're guilty before you've even had a chance to speak. This is about the weight of accusation, the suffocating loneliness of being labeled a monster, and the 34-year journey to prove that monsters sometimes were the most trusted faces. If you know what it feels like to be judged unfairly, to carry a burden you didn't earn, then this story is for you. Subscribe now, because by the end of this, you'll understand why some secrets refuse to stay buried, and why the truth always finds its way home. Hollow Creek was the kind of town where everyone knew your business before you did. Population 3,000, give or take. The kind of place where Friday night football was religion, where the diner on Main Street had been serving the same meatloaf recipe since 1952, and where nothing, absolutely nothing, ever happened that could make the evening news. Until Krista. I met Krista Martin on the first day of 7th grade. She walked into Mrs. Patterson's English class wearing a Led Zeppelin t-shirt, ripped jeans, and combat boots that her mother absolutely hated. Her hair was wild, this untamable mane of dark curls that seemed to have a personality of its own. She sat down next to me, looked at the copy of The Outsiders I was reading, and said, "Stay gold, pony boy." That was it. That was all it took. We were inseparable from that moment forward. Krista was everything I wasn't. Bold where I was timid, loud where I was quiet. She had this way of walking into a room and owning it, like the air itself rearranged to accommodate her presence. Her laugh was infectious, this big, genuine sound that came from somewhere deep in her belly. She wasn't afraid of anything, or at least that's what I thought back then. Her family had moved to Hollow Creek from Chicago after her father got a job at the paper mill. Mr. Martin was a quiet man, the kind who spent his evenings in the garage tinkering with old radios and avoided eye contact at parent-teacher conferences. Mrs. Martin was the opposite, social, involved, always volunteering for the PTA and organizing bake sales. And then there was Danny, Krista's older brother by 4 years. Danny, who had just come back from 2 years at community college. Danny, with his easy smile and his athletic build and his way of making every girl in town blush when he walked by. By the summer of 1989, Krista and I had been best friends for 5 years. We had survived first heartbreaks, family drama, the nightmare of sophomore year chemistry, and the particular cruelty that teenage girls can inflict on each other. We had plans, big plans. We were going to graduate, leave Hollow Creek in our rearview mirror, and never look back. Krista wanted to study journalism in New York. I wanted to write novels. We'd get an apartment together in Manhattan, somewhere small and cramped and absolutely perfect. But Hollow Creek had other plans for us. That summer was strange from the beginning. Hot in a way that felt personal, like the sun itself had a grudge against our little corner of Wisconsin. The kind of heat that made dogs too tired to bark and kept everyone indoors during the afternoon hours. Tempers flared easily. Patience wore thin. Even the nights brought little relief, the humidity hanging in the air like a wet blanket you couldn't shake off. Krista had been acting differently since June. Nothing obvious at first, just small things. She'd get distant during our conversations, her eyes drifting to somewhere I couldn't follow. She stopped talking about New York. She started making excuses to cut our hangouts short. And there were phone calls. Late-night phone calls that she'd take in her room with the door closed, her voice dropping to a whisper whenever I came near. I asked her about it once, during a sleepover in mid-July. We were lying on her bedroom floor, the box fan doing its pathetic best to circulate the thick air, and I finally gathered the courage to say what I'd been thinking for weeks. "Chris, what's going on with you?" She didn't answer right away. In the dim light from her bedside lamp, I could see her jaw tighten, see something flash across her face that might have been fear. "Nothing," she said. "Just summer weird, you know? Everyone gets summer weird." But it wasn't nothing. I knew it wasn't nothing. Krista had never been able to lie to me, and she wasn't starting now. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. If I had pushed harder that night, if I had demanded she tell me the truth, would things have turned out differently? I've asked myself that question every single day for 34 years. The answer, I've learned, is more complicated than I ever could have imagined. August 14th, 1989, started like any other day. I woke up to the sound of my mother banging around in the kitchen, making her famous blueberry pancakes. My father was already at work. He managed the hardware store on Oak Street and always opened early. The radio was playing some song by Richard Marx, and the morning sun was streaming through my bedroom window, promising another scorching day. Krista and I had plans to meet at the creek that afternoon. It was our spot, a little bend in the water about a mile into the woods where the trees hung low and provided shade. We'd been going there since we were 12, swimming in the cool water and lying on the rocks and talking about everything and nothing. She called me around noon. Her voice was strange, tight, controlled in a way that immediately put me on edge. "Beck, I need to tell you something. Tonight. At the creek. 8 o'clock, okay? And don't tell anyone. Promise me you won't tell anyone." "Chris, you're scaring me. What's going on?" 8 o'clock. "Promise me, Rebecca." I promised. That was the last time I ever heard Krista Martin's voice. At 7:45 p.m. on August 14th, 1989, I grabbed my flashlight and headed into the woods. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks that seemed almost ironic given what was about to unfold. The air was thick with the smell of pine and the sound of cicadas, their rhythmic buzzing creating a soundtrack that I would forever associate with loss. The path to our spot was well-worn from years of use. I could have walked it blindfolded. My sneakers crunched on the dried leaves and twigs, and somewhere in the distance, an owl was beginning its nightly calls. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even, the kind of evening that poets write about. I reached the creek at exactly 7:58. I remember checking my watch, a cheap digital thing my dad had given me for my 16th birthday. The water was moving slowly, barely a trickle after weeks without rain. The rocks where we usually sat were dry and warm, still holding the heat of the day. Krista wasn't there. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. 15. The sun dipped below the tree line, and the woods began their transformation from familiar to something else entirely. Shadows stretched and merged. Sounds became harder to identify. That sense of peace I'd felt earlier started to curdle into something uncomfortable. By 8:30, I was worried. By 9 o'clock, I was scared. Krista was never late. In the 5 years I'd known her, she had never once stood me up. She was the reliable one, the organized one, the one who kept track of dates and times while I floated through life in my own little world. I started walking toward her house. It was about a 20-minute walk through the woods, and then another 10 down Maple Street. The flashlight beam cut through the growing darkness, illuminating nothing out of the ordinary. Just trees, just dirt, just the familiar landscape of my childhood transformed by night into something almost alien. The Martin house was quiet when I arrived. Too quiet. No lights in the windows. No sound of the television or radio. Mrs. Martin's car was in the driveway, but Mr. Martin's truck was gone. I walked up the porch steps, my heart beating faster than it should have been, and knocked on the door. Nothing. I knocked again, louder this time. The door swung open, and Mrs. Martin stood there looking like she'd seen a ghost. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy. She was clutching a dish towel in her hands, twisting it over and over like she was trying to wring the life out of it. "Rebecca," she said, and her voice cracked on my name. "Is Krista with you? Please tell me Krista is with you." The bottom dropped out of my stomach. I know. We were supposed to meet at the creek, but she never showed up. I thought maybe she was here, and Mrs. Martin let out a sound that I will never forget. Not a scream exactly, but something worse. Something primal. She collapsed against the doorframe, and I caught her instinctively, my 17-year-old body struggling to support her weight. "She's gone," Mrs. Martin whispered. "My baby's gone." The next few hours exist in my memory as fragments. Flashes of light and sound that don't quite connect. Police cars pulling up to the Martin house, their red and blue lights painting the neighborhood in colors that felt violent. Officers with notepads asking questions I couldn't answer. Mrs. Martin's continued sobbing as she sat on the couch, surrounded by neighbors who had appeared out of nowhere, drawn by the commotion. And then there was Chief Robert Holloway. Chief Holloway had been running the Hollow Creek Police Department since before I was born. He was a big man, barrel-chested with a face weathered by decades of Wisconsin winters. He had a reputation for being fair, for being thorough, for solving the occasional petty theft or drunk driving incident that constituted crime in our little town. But Chief Holloway had never dealt with a missing girl before. And from the moment he arrived at the Martin house, I could see that he was out of his depth. He pulled me aside around midnight. My parents had arrived by then, my mother pale and shaking, my father with that stoic expression he always wore when he was trying to stay calm. Chief Holloway led me to his patrol car, opened the back door, and gestured for me to sit. "Rebecca, I need to ask you some questions. You're not in trouble. I just need to understand what happened tonight." I told him everything. The phone call at noon. Krista's strange voice. Our plan to meet at the creek at 8. My walk through the woods. Finding the creek empty. My journey to the Martin house. He wrote it all down in his little notepad, nodding occasionally, his face unreadable. "And you're sure she said 8 o'clock? Not some other time?" "I'm sure. She didn't say anything about where she might go? Anyone she might meet?" "No. She just said she needed to tell me something. Something important. She made me promise not to tell anyone." Chief Holloway's pen paused. "Promise not to tell anyone what exactly?" "I don't know. She never got the chance to tell me." He studied me for a long moment. In the flashing lights of the patrol cars, his face looked strange. Hard in a way I hadn't noticed before. "Rebecca, had you and Krista been fighting lately? Any arguments? Disagreements?" "What? No. We're best friends. We don't fight. All best friends fight sometimes." "We didn't. We don't." Another long pause. "Some folks are saying they saw you and Krista arguing outside the library last week." Raised voices. Krista looked upset. I felt the blood drain from my face. "The library. Last Thursday. But that hadn't been a fight. We'd been practicing a scene from a play we were doing for drama class. We'd been acting. The characters were supposed to be fighting. That wasn't real. We were rehearsing for drama class. We were doing a scene from our town. It required yelling." Chief Holloway wrote something in his notepad. The scratch of his pen against paper suddenly sounded very loud. "I see." But I could tell from his tone that he didn't see. Or rather, he saw something that wasn't there. Something that would soon take on a life of its own and consume everything in its path. The search for Krista Martin began at dawn on August 15th. Volunteers from all over Hollow Creek and the surrounding areas showed up. Farmers, factory workers, teachers, teenagers. They formed lines and walked through the woods, calling her name until their voices went hoarse. They dragged the creek, the pond behind the old Miller farm, every body of water within a 10-mile radius. They checked abandoned barns and empty houses and anywhere else a 17-year-old girl might hide. They found nothing. No body, no clothing, no signs of struggle. It was as if Krista Martin had simply ceased to exist. And in the absence of answers, people started looking for someone to blame. The whispers started small. Little comments at the diner, hushed conversations at the grocery store that stopped abruptly when I walked by. She was the last one to see her. They were supposed to meet that night. I always thought there was something off about that Shaw girl. Within a week, I had gone from Hollow Creek's quiet, bookish teenager to its prime suspect in the disappearance of Krista Martin. The thing about small towns is that they have long memories and short fuses. The community that had watched me grow up, that had seen me at church every Sunday, that had cheered when I won the 8th grade spelling bee. That same community turned on me with a speed that still takes my breath away. The police questioned me 4 more times in the 2 weeks following Krista's disappearance. Each time, the questions became more pointed, more accusatory. Each time, I left feeling less like a witness and more like a criminal. "You say you were at the creek at 8. But no one can verify that, can they?" The phone call. Are you sure Krista actually made that call? Or are you making that up to cover your tracks? We've talked to some of your classmates, Rebecca. They say you were jealous of Krista, that she was more popular, more outgoing, that she had things you wanted. The accusations were absurd. Jealous? Of course I sometimes envied Krista's confidence, her ease with people. But jealousy as a motive for what? Murder? They still hadn't found a body. They had no evidence that Krista was even dead. But that didn't seem to matter. Here's something I need you to think about. Have you ever been in a situation where people decided who you were before you had a chance to show them? Where no amount of truth could penetrate the story they had already written about you? I want to know if you've experienced this, because if you have, you'll understand exactly why the next 34 years of my life became what they became. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been judged for something you didn't do? How did it shape who you became? My parents stood by me through those early weeks, but I could see the strain it put on them. My mother's hair seemed to gray overnight. My father lost weight, his face becoming gaunt and hollow. They believed me. I know they believed me, but the constant onslaught of suspicion was taking its toll. The worst part was Danny Martin. Danny, who I had known since I was 12. Danny, who had taught me how to skip rocks at the creek and had once defended me when some older kids at school called me names. Danny, who had always been kind and friendly and easy to be around. Danny, who stood on our front porch 3 weeks after Krista vanished and called me a murderer. I was in the living room when I heard the shouting. My father was at the door, trying to calm Danny down, but Danny was beyond reason. His face was twisted with grief and rage, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I know she did something," he screamed. "I know she knows where my sister is. Make her tell us. Make her tell us what she did." My mother pulled me away from the window, but not before Danny saw me. Our eyes met for just a moment, and the hatred in his gaze hit me like a physical blow. "You'll pay for this, Rebecca," he shouted. "If it takes me the rest of my life, I'll make sure you pay for what you did to Krista." The police eventually came and took him away. He hadn't committed a crime, just been publicly threatening, which in Hollow Creek was apparently not enough to do anything about. But his word stayed with me. His promise. If it takes me the rest of my life. I couldn't stay in Hollow Creek. That became clear by the end of September. School had started, but I couldn't go. The one time I tried, I found my locker covered in red paint with the word killer scrawled across it. My teachers looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. My former friends pretended I didn't exist, or worse, whispered behind my back loud enough for me to hear. My parents made the decision to send me to live with my aunt in Michigan. A fresh start, they called it. A chance to get away from the spotlight until all of this blew over. But it never blew over. The story of Krista Martin became one of those unsolved mysteries that people couldn't let go of. Every few years, some true crime show would dredge it up again. Podcasts would dissect every detail. Amateur sleuths would post theories on the internet. And every single one of them pointed to the same suspect. Me. I finished high school in Michigan. I went to a small college downstate, studying English literature because Krista and I had planned to be writers together, and giving that up felt like betraying her memory. I got a job at a publishing house, working behind the scenes where no one knew my name or my history. I built a life that was small and quiet and safe, and I never stopped looking for answers. Every spare moment I had, I researched. I compiled files. I went over every detail of that summer, every conversation Krista and I had, every strange behavior I had noticed. Something had been wrong. She had wanted to tell me something. Someone had stopped her before she could. But who? The obvious answer was a stranger. Random violence. Wrong place, wrong time. That's what the police officially concluded after the investigation went cold. Case unsolved. No arrests made. No evidence of foul play. Though the absence of a body made that last part almost laughable. But I didn't believe it was a stranger. Krista was smart. Krista was careful. And Krista had been scared of something specific, something close to home. The phone calls. The secretive behavior. The way she had asked me to promise not to tell anyone. That wasn't random. That was someone she knew. Someone she was afraid of. For years, I ran through the list of possibilities. Mr. Patterson, the history teacher everyone thought was creepy. Tyler Brooks, the senior who had asked Krista out and hadn't taken her rejection well. Even Chief Holloway, whose eagerness to blame me had always seemed suspicious. But I kept coming back to one person, one name that sat in my mind like a stone I couldn't dislodge. Danny Martin. I know what you're thinking. Danny was Krista's brother, her protector, the one who had been devastated by her disappearance, who had stood on my porch and sworn to spend his life making me pay. Surely he couldn't have had anything to do with it. But here's what I've learned in 34 years of searching for the truth. The people who scream the loudest about justice are often the ones with the most to hide. I started researching Danny Martin in earnest around 2005. The internet made things easier. Public records, social media, the traces we all leave behind without realizing it. Danny had stayed in Hollow Creek after his parents passed away. His father died of a heart attack in 1994, his mother of cancer in 2001. Danny inherited the family house and never left. He had gotten married in 1995 to a woman named Sandra Collins from the next town over. They divorced in 2002. No children. Sandra had moved to Florida and, according to her Facebook page, seemed to be living a perfectly ordinary life. I found Sandra's phone number through a people search website. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to call her. Hello. Her voice was cautious, the way people answer calls from unknown numbers. Sandra? Sandra Martin. Who is this? My name is Rebecca Shaw. I was a friend of Krista Martin's. I'm trying to. The line went dead. I called back. No answer. Called again. Same thing. But that night, I received an email from an anonymous address. Stop digging. For your own safety. Stop digging. I should have been scared. Part of me was. But a larger part, the part that had spent 3 decades under a cloud of suspicion, felt something else entirely. Vindication. If there was nothing to hide, why would someone want me to stop looking? If Krista's disappearance was truly the random act of violence the police claimed, why would my questions make anyone nervous? Someone was hiding something, and I was going to find out what. I took early retirement from my job in 2019. 50 years old, modest savings, no family of my own. I had never married, never had children, never allowed myself that kind of vulnerability. My entire life had been lived in the shadow of August 14th, 1989, and I was finally going to step out of it. I moved back to Wisconsin, not to Hollow Creek. I wasn't ready for that, and frankly, I wasn't sure the town was ready for me. But I rented a small apartment in Madison, close enough to make the drive when I needed to, far enough to maintain my distance. And I started digging. The Hollow Creek Police Department had changed a lot since 1989. Chief Holloway had retired in 2003 and died in 2008. A new generation of officers had taken over, and they were more willing to cooperate with my requests for old case files. Cold case protocols had evolved. Everything was digital now, and someone had apparently scanned the original Martin investigation documents years ago. I spent months going through every page. Most of it I already knew, my own statements, the timeline of that night, the fruitless search efforts. But there were things I hadn't seen before. Witness interviews that the police had never shared with me. Notes from conversations with Krista's family. And one detail that stopped me cold. On August 12, 1989, 2 days before Krista vanished, an unidentified woman had called the Hollow Creek police tip line. The call was short, just a few sentences, but the dispatcher had noted the content. Someone needs to check on the Martin girl. Her brother is doing something to her. I've seen it. Someone needs to help her. The caller had hung up before providing any further information. The dispatcher had flagged the call as requiring follow-up, but there was no documentation of anyone actually following up. No visit to the Martin house. No interview with Krista or Danny. Nothing. 2 days later, Krista was gone. I read that note 100 times. 1,000. I read it until the words lost their meaning and then gained it back again, sharper than before. Her brother is doing something to her. What had Danny Martin been doing to his sister? The possibilities made me sick to even consider. But I had to consider them. I had to understand. I hired a private investigator. His name was Marcus Chun, a former police detective from Milwaukee who now worked cold cases as a side business. He was expensive, but he was good, and he was discreet. You want me to investigate a disappearance from 1989? He said when I laid out the case. A case the police already closed? I want you to investigate Daniel Martin. I want to know everything about him. His past, his present, his secrets. Everything. Marcus studied me for a long moment. You know you're the main suspect in this case, right? If I find something that points back to you, you won't. Because I didn't do anything. He nodded slowly. Okay, I'll see what I can find. What Marcus found over the next 6 months changed everything. Danny Martin had a pattern. Marcus documented it meticulously. Between 1991 and 2023, at least 4 women had filed police reports naming Danny Martin as the perpetrator of stalking, harassment, or assault. All 4 cases had been dismissed or dropped before going to trial. In each instance, the woman had either recanted her story, moved away suddenly, or simply stopped cooperating with investigators. It's a pattern we see with serial abusers, Marcus explained during one of our meetings. They're good at choosing victims who won't be believed. They're good at applying pressure, threats, intimidation, sometimes financial leverage, to make problems go away. And no one connected the dots? Different jurisdictions, different decades, different officers handling each case. Without someone looking at the big picture, it just looks like 4 unrelated incidents. But Marcus had looked at the big picture, and the picture was damning. One of the 4 women, a woman named Patricia Hollins, had been brave enough to speak to Marcus directly. She had dated Danny briefly in 2008, and her account made my blood run cold. He was charming at first, Patricia told Marcus. But then he got controlling. Wanted to know where I was every minute. Got angry if I talked to other men. And then one night, he hurt me. I filed a report, but he showed up at my apartment the next day. He said if I didn't drop the charges, I'd end up like his sister. End up like his sister. The words hung in the air between us when Marcus shared the recording. He knew what happened to Krista, I said. He knew because he did it. That's what Patricia believed. She dropped the charges and moved to California the next week. Never came back. But Patricia had given Marcus one more piece of information. Something Danny had let slip during one of his rages. He said he had proof that he was protected. That he had kept something all these years, something that guaranteed no one would ever touch him. He said it was buried where only he could find it. Something buried. For 3 decades, they had searched everywhere for Krista's body. Every inch of forest, every pond, every abandoned building. But they had been looking in the obvious places. The public places. Where would Danny bury something he wanted to protect? Somewhere he had complete control. Somewhere no one would think to look. The Martin family home. Danny still lived there, alone, in the same house where he and Krista had grown up. The same house where Mrs. Martin had answered the door that terrible night, her face white with fear. The same house where something unspeakable might have been hidden for 34 years. I knew what I had to do, but I also knew I couldn't do it alone. I went to the Hollow Creek Police Department. The new chief, a woman named Angela Torres who was roughly my age, listened to my story with an expression that was harder to read than I would have liked. You're suggesting that Danny Martin killed his own sister and has been hiding evidence in his house for 3 decades, she summarized when I finished. I'm suggesting it's worth investigating. Based on an anonymous tip from 1989 and the testimony of a woman who may or may not be reliable. Based on a pattern of behavior and evidence that was overlooked the first time around. Chief Torres leaned back in her chair. Ms. Shaw, I'm going to be honest with you. Your name is on this case in a way that makes your involvement complicated. If I start an investigation based on your accusations, Danny Martin's lawyers will have a field day. They'll say you're trying to frame him to clear your own name. That's exactly what he's counting on. He's counting on no one believing me because I've already been condemned. I'm not condemning you. I'm just explaining the situation. I felt the old familiar frustration rising in my chest. 34 years of not being believed. 34 years of being dismissed and ignored and suspected. But I pushed it down. Getting angry wouldn't help. What would you need? I asked. What would it take to get you to take this seriously? Chief Torres considered the question. Something concrete. Something that couldn't be explained away or attributed to your personal vendetta. If you could get me that, I could open an official investigation. Something concrete. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to get into that house. I was going to find whatever Danny had buried there. And I was going to prove, once and for all, that I had been telling the truth all along. It was dangerous. It was probably illegal. And it was the only option I had left. Marcus refused to help me with what I was planning. I'm not going to be party to a breaking and entering that could get you arrested and destroy any chance of a legitimate prosecution, he said. If you do this and you find something, any decent lawyer will get it thrown out of court. He was right. I knew he was right. But I was beyond caring about court cases and legal procedures. I just needed to know. The opportunity came in early October 2023. Danny Martin was scheduled to speak at a memorial event for Krista in the next town over, an annual gathering of people who had never given up hope of finding out what happened to her. The irony was not lost on me. The man who had likely killed her, standing up to give speeches about finding justice for her. The event started at 7. That gave me at least 3 hours. I waited until dark, then drove to Hollow Creek with a flashlight, a small shovel, and a heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. The Martin house sat at the end of Maple Street, set back from the road and surrounded by overgrown trees. Danny had let the property fall into disrepair over the years. The paint was peeling, the gutters were clogged with leaves, and the yard was more weed than grass. The back door had a lock that looked like it hadn't been changed since the 1980s. It took me 30 seconds to pick it with a technique I'd learned from a YouTube video. The door swung open, and I stepped into the house where my best friend had spent the last hours of her life. The smell hit me first. Dust and mildew and something else underneath, something sour that I couldn't identify. The kitchen was a disaster, dirty dishes piled in the sink, garbage overflowing from a trash can that hadn't been emptied in weeks. But I wasn't there for the kitchen. Patricia had said Danny kept something buried, something that guaranteed his protection. I started in the basement. The stairs creaked as I descended, each sound seeming to echo through the empty house like a warning. My flashlight beam swept across concrete walls and exposed pipes and decades of accumulated junk. Old furniture, boxes of Christmas decorations, a rusted bicycle that might have been Krista's. The floor was concrete, but in one corner, the concrete looked newer than the rest. Smoother, poured at a different time. My hands were shaking as I started to dig at the edge of it with my shovel. The concrete wasn't thick. Whoever had poured it had done a hasty job. Chunks of it broke away easily, revealing dark soil beneath. I dug. The first thing my shovel hit was fabric. Rotted and discolored, but unmistakably fabric. I brushed the dirt away with my hands. My heart stopped in my chest, and I saw what I had been looking for. A backpack. Purple, with pins and patches and a faded Led Zeppelin logo. Krista's backpack. Inside it, wrapped in plastic that had somehow survived the decades, were items that told a story I had never fully understood until that moment. A journal, filled with Krista's handwriting. Photographs that made me physically sick. And a letter, addressed to me, that Krista had never had the chance to deliver. Dear Beck, it began. If you're reading this, something has happened to me. I'm writing this because I need someone to know the truth, and you're the only person I trust. I read the letter there in the darkness of the basement where my best friend had been buried for 34 years. I read about the abuse that had started when Danny came back from college. I read about her shame and her fear and her desperate plan to escape. I read about how she was going to tell me everything that night at the creek, and then we were going to run, together, to the police in the next town, far from the reach of her family's influence. She never made it to the creek. Danny had intercepted her. He had known, somehow, that she was planning to expose him, and he had silenced her forever. But he hadn't counted on this. The evidence she had hidden. The insurance policy she had created, knowing that her brother might try to stop her. Krista had given me the weapon to destroy him. She had been waiting, all these years, for me to find it. I called 911 from the basement, my voice surprisingly steady as I reported what I had found. Then I sat down next to my best friend's remains and waited. For the first time in 34 years, I felt something I had forgotten was possible. Hope. Danny Martin was arrested at the memorial event, in front of 50 people who had gathered to honor his sister's memory. The look on his face when the police officers approached him, that moment of realization that his decades of protection had finally crumbled, was something I wished I could have witnessed in person. Instead, I watched it on the news from a hospital bed. Apparently, I had been so focused on my search that I hadn't noticed I had been inhaling toxic mold spores in that basement for hours. I spent 3 days recovering while the world outside exploded with the story of Krista Martin. The journal and photographs were enough for an arrest, but it was the letter that sealed his fate. Krista had documented everything: dates, times, descriptions of what her brother had done to her. She had known that no one would believe her word against his, so she had created evidence that couldn't be denied, and she had trusted me to find it. The trial took place in the spring of 2024. I testified about the night Krista disappeared, about the phone call, about the years I had spent trying to clear my name and find the truth. The prosecution presented the physical evidence: the backpack, the journal, the forensic analysis that confirmed the remains in the basement belonged to Krista Martin. Danny's lawyers tried every trick in the book. They attacked my credibility. They claimed I had planted the evidence. They suggested that the basement had been accessed by multiple people over the years and that anyone could have buried those items. But the jury didn't buy it. Neither did the judge. Daniel Martin was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was 62 years old. He would die behind bars. When the verdict was read, I was sitting in the courtroom surrounded by people I had never met: journalists, true crime enthusiasts, families of other victims who had come to witness justice being served. But in that moment, I felt completely alone. Alone with Krista. Alone with the girl who had been my best friend, who had trusted me with her darkest secret even though she never got to share it with me in person. I had kept my promise, I realized. She had asked me not to tell anyone, and I hadn't. But I had never stopped looking for the truth she had been too afraid to speak. The days after the verdict were surreal. Media requests flooded in. Publishers wanted me to write a book. Documentary crews wanted to tell my story. Everyone wanted a piece of the woman who had solved a 34-year-old cold case. I said no to all of it. What I wanted, more than anything, was quiet. What I wanted was to finally grieve. I scattered Krista's ashes at the creek on August 14, 2024. 35 years to the day since she disappeared. The water was flowing again after a rainy summer, and the trees hung low over the banks just like they always had. My parents were there. They were in their 80s now, slower and grayer, but they had never stopped believing in me. They had never stopped waiting for this day. Chief Torres came too, along with a few of the officers who had worked the case. They stood at a respectful distance while I said my goodbyes. I told Krista about my life, about the years of loneliness and the small joys I had managed to find despite everything, about the books I had read and the places I had traveled and the quiet apartment where I had spent so many nights thinking about her. I told her I was sorry. Sorry I hadn't pushed harder that summer. Sorry I hadn't seen what was happening right in front of me. Sorry I hadn't been there to save her. But I also told her I was proud. Proud that she had been brave enough to document her abuse. Proud that she had created the evidence that would eventually bring her killer to justice. Proud that even in her darkest moments, she had believed that the truth would someday come out. You were always the brave one, Chris, I whispered as the ashes caught the current and began to drift downstream. You were always the strong one. The water carried her away, toward the river, toward the lake, toward wherever the current chose to take her. And I stood there watching until the last traces of her were gone. When I turned around, there was someone standing at the edge of the clearing. A woman about my age, with dark curly hair going gray and eyes that I recognized instantly. Rebecca, she said. Rebecca Shaw? It was Sandra, Danny's ex-wife. The woman who had hung up on me all those years ago. She walked toward me slowly, her expression uncertain. I saw on the news about the trial. I had to come. I had to tell you. She stopped, struggling to find the words. I knew. Not everything. But I knew something was wrong with him. I knew there was a darkness in him that he tried to hide. When you called me that day, I was scared. Scared of what he might do if he found out I had talked to you. So I warned you off instead. I'm sorry. I should have been angry. Part of me was. But a larger part was just tired. Tired of anger, tired of blame, tired of the weight I had been carrying for so long. You survived him, I said. That's what matters. Sandra's eyes filled with tears. I should have done more. I should have been braver. We all should have. We stood there in silence for a moment. Two women connected by a tragedy neither of us had fully understood until now. Then Sandra reached into her purse and pulled out something small and weathered. I found this in his things when I moved out. I didn't know what it meant at the time, but I kept it anyway. Something told me it was important. She handed it to me. It was a photograph, faded with age, of two teenage girls sitting on a rock by a creek. One with dark curly hair, laughing at something the camera couldn't capture. One quieter, watching her friend with unmistakable affection. Krista and me. The summer before everything changed. He kept it all these years, Sandra said. I don't know why, but I knew. Danny had kept it as a trophy, a reminder of what he had taken, a memento of his power over both of us, the sister he had killed and the friend he had destroyed. I looked at the photograph for a long time. Then I walked to the edge of the creek and let it fall into the water. It's over now, I said, to Krista, to Sandra, to myself. It's finally over. Hollow Creek never fully apologized for what it put me through. A few people reached out after the trial, former classmates, old neighbors, to say they were sorry for not believing me. I accepted their apologies and moved on. There was no point in holding grudges against people who had simply believed the story they were told. But I didn't stay in Wisconsin. There were too many ghosts there, too many memories that couldn't be overwritten by a court verdict. I moved to New York. Not Manhattan. I couldn't afford that. And anyway, the city Krista and I had dreamed about was a fantasy that belonged to our youth. But I found a small apartment in Brooklyn, near a coffee shop that reminded me of the diner in Hollow Creek and a bookstore that stayed open late. I started writing. Not about Krista. That story wasn't mine to tell, not really. But about other things. Stories of young women finding their strength. Stories of truth outlasting lies. Stories of people who refused to be silenced, no matter how long it took for someone to listen. Last week, I got a letter from a girl in Ohio. She was 17 years old, the same age Krista and I had been that final summer. She wrote that she had heard my story and that it had given her the courage to speak up about something that was happening in her own family. She wrote that she wanted me to know that Krista's bravery, and mine, had saved her life. I read that letter and I cried. Not tears of sadness. I was done with those. But tears of something else. Something that felt like completion. Krista Martin deserved to be remembered for more than how she died. She deserved to be remembered for who she was. A girl who loved Led Zeppelin and English literature and making her quiet best friend laugh. A girl who faced unspeakable horror with courage and clarity. A girl who, even in her final moments, was thinking about how to protect others. She was 17 years old. And she was braver than anyone I have ever known. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure the world knows her name. The summer I turned 17, I watched my best friend disappear into thin air. For 34 years, everyone believed I was the one who killed her. But the truth always finds its way home. And sometimes, the people we love the most never really leave us. They just wait, patiently, in the places we're afraid to look, until we're finally ready to set them free. This is the story of Krista Martin. This is the story of how she saved herself, even after death. And this is the story of how believing in someone, truly believing, even when the whole world tells you you're wrong, can change everything. If you've made it to the end, I want you to remember something. The people in your life who seem unremarkable, who seem ordinary, who seem like they have nothing to hide, they all have stories. Some of those stories are beautiful, some are tragic, and some are cries for help that we're too busy or too blind to hear. Listen, pay attention, believe people when they tell you something is wrong. You might be the only one who does.